Hello, welcome to the Family Research Council. My name is Bethany DeMin, and I'm the Student Interns and Lectures Coordinator here. I'm only here to do a couple of housekeeping items, and then I'm going to hand off the microphone for the introduction of our special guest. If you're watching online, we want to welcome you. Thank you for joining us. Also want to just remind all of you watching at home and here that we do tape and archive all of our lectures here. So if you would please share the link for this lecture on your various social media platforms afterwards, we would really appreciate that. That greatly increases our reach. So we appreciate your help with that. At this time, I want to welcome our own General Boykin to the podium to introduce our special guest, Bob McGinnis.
That was a pretty weak applause, I might add. Hey, it's a privilege for me to be able to introduce Bob McGinnis this afternoon. And I think most of you know Bob. Bob is a West Point graduate commissioned as an infantry officer. Retired from the Army, having served literally in about every infantry position you could serve in. He's also a graduate of the Navy Postgraduate School in Monterey. And for the last 22 years, Bob has been involved in providing analysis for the media, primarily with Fox News and CNN, but also with others. And he's a prolific writer who has written over 800 articles on national security and foreign affairs type things. I think we had Bob in here previously when he wrote his first book, which really was a book that was all about the mistake that America was making by forcing women into certain combat arms organizations that where they clearly were going to be at a disadvantage for a variety of reasons and in a variety of ways. It was called Deadly Consequences. And now today he is unveiling his new book, which is Never Submit. I got a copy of it up on my desk. I don't know if you gave that to me or not, Bob, but you're not getting it back. And Will the Extermination of Christians Get Worse Before It Gets Better is the subtitle of this. But Bob's most important accomplishment in his life was the fact that even though he's still working at the Pentagon, still involved in national security and foreign affairs and all kinds of things, his most important accomplishment is that he used to be the Vice President for Policy here at the Family Research Council. So welcome back one of our own, Bob McGinnis.
Thank you, General. Now, do I need to be up here or can I stay down here? Up would be better. Oh, goodness. I'd rather be down with the crowd. I know why the interns are here because it's free food. I used to be here. So I understand that. It is a privilege to be here. And I appreciate Bethany, FRC, General Boykin, for giving me the opportunity. This is actually a practice. I'm going to make some presentations on the left coast to the west coast here in the next week or so. So I decided, well, FRC is a great place to practice because the interns are at least attentive, and they do attend, and occasionally you get a little media in here. I'm only 15 minutes away down at the Pentagon. I'm an operations officer. I've been there this time for 13 years. So when I left here being a VP, I started doing international affairs down there. So I've been doing this stuff since I was an 18-year-old at West Point. So that's a long time ago. As I go through this, and I'll go through it relatively quick, and I have a series of slides, feel free to ask questions. If I don't get through it, that's fine. You can read the book. And we'll go from there, okay? And I have technology here, so I'll see if it can work. I've never done it with this little device, but this is fun. My wife gave it to me the other day, and I say, well, maybe I can try this. Well, President Obama's, and I'm going to read part of it and then ad-lib from there. President Obama's failed foreign policies nudged some Mideast governments to the brink of chaos and destroyed others, which, even though they were not democratic utopias, at least they provided governance and public order. Further, these failures have contributed to the abandonment of Mideast Christians to the authorities or to the atrocities of the Sunni Islamists and the murderous proxies of the Iranian Islamic Revolution, and I would say are ultimately the cause of the tsunami of mostly Muslim young men now invading Western Europe. So unless something quickly is done, this crisis will get not only worse, but the perpetrators will increase their assault here on the West. The answer to this tragic situation, I would argue, is never submit to Islamists, whether in the Middle East or here in America. So I'll address my book, Never Submit. Let's see if this works. There we go. Will the extermination of Christians get worse before it gets better? Now, Never Submit is really a call for action. A call for action to help those that are facing genocide in the Middle East. The world's efforts have been totally, in my opinion, inadequate. In fact, the conditions contributing to the Christian genocide are metastasizing across the region. And the title for the book, Never Submit, is purposely in your face. It's taken from the meaning of the verb noun Islam, which means submission. I could have named the book Never Islam. It's my simple exhortation to never submit to the violent disciples of Islam. Now what I'll do is go through the sections of the book and I'll give some highlights. So section 1, the actual genocide. Arguably, the Mideast Christian genocide started not with ISIS today, but in 2003, when we, the United States and our allies, invaded Iraq. After all, Saddam Hussein, allowed Christians to worship openly. They were part of his government. Well, the removal of Saddam and others, I would argue, started this ugly Shia-Sunni revolution. That in turn spawned ISIS and arguably as well the Arab Spring, which started in Tunisia and went across the region. Now, consider some recent history regarding the state of this genocide today. Everywhere the U.S., quote, helped Islamic jihadis topple secular autocrats in the name of democracy and freedom, the indigenous Christian minorities were forced either to convert to Islam, to leave, or die. So today the situation is getting worse. The Mideast religious-based genocide is distinct, though, but simultaneous with all the wars that you see in the region. Christians, yes, they face the wartime deprivations, pardon me, that everyone else does in Syria or Yemen or Libya or wherever. But they also are surrounded by persecuting governments, and they're experiencing a relentless and deliberate extermination campaign thanks to ISIS and some of the other Islamist groups. As you'll recall, 15 months ago, June of 14, ISIS launched its so-called caliphate, its Islamic State. What they started to do is they would put this Arabic in for Nazarene, a denigrating comment about Christians, on homes in Mosul. Well, then they started to delete every trace of the ancient presence of Christians. They started to behead people, to enslave, to forcibly convert, to rob Christians of everything that they had in their possession. This ISIS savagery, unfortunately, knows no bounds at all. Recently, if you've read what happened, for instance, to a dozen or so Christians in Aleppo, Syria. What they did is they tortured, they mutilated, they publicly raped, they beheaded, and they crucified these Christians for saying, quote, they would never renounce Christ for Muhammad. Well, unfortunately, the history of the region is pretty bad. In 1910, we had about 15% were Christians in the Middle East. Today, it's less than 2% and rapidly declining. Even in Iraq, and I've been to Iraq a number of times, when we invaded in 2003, there were 1.5 million Christians. Today, there's less than 200,000, and those numbers are rapidly declining. So who besides Bob McGinnis says that this is a genocide? Well, there are many members of Congress that say it's genocide. That's why they've called for some legislation saying what's happening to Christians is genocide. Even Representative Issue, who I don't agree on a lot of issues, she's the daughter of a Christian from Iraq, and she says it's an existential threat to Christians. Pope Francis called it a genocide. Senior UN officials call it a genocide. Even the man who coined the word genocide, and this is what he said genocide is. It's a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. What's worse than perhaps fleeing the barbarity of ISIS? Well, it's perhaps staying behind where ISIS is. Specifically, one aspect of genocide is the process of systematically removing people groups from existence. And that's what ISIS is doing. Just last month, there were 270 Christians near Aleppo who made a bargain with the devil, ISIS. They said, we will stay here in exchange, we will be zimmi, which is basically, we'll go under your rule. And what does that mean? Well, they pay a tax, like all unbelievers. They're forbidden to build churches. They can't wear a cross. They can't carry a Bible. They may not make Muslims hear the sounds of their worship, such as bells. All Christians' worship is forbidden in public. They can't own firearms. And they must abide by 7th century ISIS dress code. Well, so what's the result? The destruction of Christianity in that community. And of course, ISIS wins. So what does the West do about this genocide in the Mideast? Well, arguably not enough. The so-called moderate Muslims in Syria who persecute Christians, they're doing the same thing as the so-called radicals. For instance, last week, the Obama administration canceled the moderate rebel program. We knew from the beginning it was going to be a failure. My real job is I actually train armies around the world. So I actually have and I run the Army's only program that trains people to train armies. So I know what I'm talking about here. We knew it was going to fail from the very beginning. What's also interesting is that he's granted asylum to mostly Middle East Christians. And you ask why? Well, it's very simple. The State Department has a litmus test. You can be an immigrant from Syria or Iraq only if you go through the UN's vetting process in a refugee camp. And what does that mean? Well, Christians don't go to refugee camps. Why? Because they have Islamists. And why? Because the Islamists threaten to kill them. So they live in burned out churches and buildings wherever they are not in refugee camps. And when the president talks about hundreds of thousands of additional people from that region, guess what? There won't be Christians that are being threatened with genocide. Obama also refuses to call it genocide. Well, I interviewed Frank Wolf, who's a well-known former congressman and a human rights activist, a religious freedom guy, and he said the following. Quote, for President Obama not to be calling it genocide, for U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Samantha Power, who wrote the classic book on genocide, is unbelievable. It is genocide. It's important, though, as we venture forward in my discussion here, that you understand a little bit about Islamic ideology and perhaps why Christians are being targeted. Now, this is a picture of the Kaaba, the black cube there in the center of the major mosque in Mecca, allegedly built by Abraham and Ishmael. And of course, the 7th century prophets said that all Muslims must bow toward this when they do their daily prayers. Well, there are three sources of Islamic doctrine: the Quran, the Hadith, and the Sirah. I call them the Islamic trilogy. For background, the Quran, of course, was a collection of revelations that Muhammad says he got from the angel Gabriel. The Hadiths, and there were about 600,000 of these allegedly, is a collection of anecdotes about Muhammad and the sayings of the prophet. And the Sirah is a biography of the prophet. Now, what Never Submit does, inside the book, I detail the Islamic ideology, and especially those parts that are radicalized by the likes of ISIS today. Now, some of that is evidenced in the following slides. The Islamic trilogy, of course, endorses violence. It talks about unbelievers or kafirs. A kafir can be deceived, hated, enslaved, tortured, killed, lied to, and cheated. In fact, 60% of the Islamic trilogy is all about kafirs, unbelievers, and what you can do with and to them. One of those things is slavery, like you see in this picture. Islamic slavery is race-based. Umar, the Muhammad's father-in-law and a caliph himself, declared that Arabs can never be enslaved, only non-Arabs, and they have to come from outside countries, and they must be kafirs. Enslavement, of course, in many cases, and if you read the popular press, you'll understand it's all about sexual abuse. Sexual abuse of non-Muslim children and women at the hands of jihadist groups such as ISIS is not only a widespread practice in the Muslim world, but has a lot to do with Islamic teachings. Sexual slavery is deeply embedded in Islamic law and tradition. In fact, Muhammad practiced and approved slavery as was more common in his time. And for instance, you had caliphs that had harems of hundreds and thousands of young girls and women. And where did they get them? Not locally. They went and imported them through invasion. Today thousands of young Christian men or women and girls are enslaved by ISIS, and primarily for sex. And the practice of sexual enslavement apparently is now institutionalized by the likes of ISIS. If you read the New York Times 2 months ago, you saw the article. It's entitled "ISIS Enshrines a Theology of Rape." It begins in the first paragraph with this ISIS guy saying, rape is not a sin. He has every right to rape this 12-year-old who he just bound and gagged. He knelt, prayed, he did the act, and then he prayed again. And he wiped his hands and walked away. Beheading, you've heard about that. It's certainly allowed of kafirs, and I cite the quotation from the Quran there. In the last year, there have been 24 very celebrated cases of public beheadings, one of which was in December of 14, in which 100 people in Raqqa were beheaded at one time. So it's encouraged for those that strictly believe the Islamic theology. Now, how many Muslims in this world, of which there are 1.6 million, really believe this stuff? Well, here's a picture of Mona Walter. She came from Somalia. She immigrated to Sweden. She called herself a Muslim, but it wasn't until she was in Stockholm and started to go to a mosque that she ever read the Quran. And this is what Mona said in her words. The Quran, it's about hating and killing those who disagree with Islam. It's about conquering. Muhammad, he was immoral. He was a bloodthirsty man. He was a terrible man. And Muslims can read that in his biography, what he did to Jews, how he raped women, how he killed people. He killed everyone who didn't agree with him, end quote. Pretty straightforward. Now, in Never Submit, I have a number of former Muslims, all of which have converted to Christianity, talking about their lives as Muslims. And they're all pretty tragic stories. But look at the broader view. Consider surveys. There was a 2012 Pew Research survey, a credible organization. They found that in the Middle East, of Muslims, 3 of 4 favor Sharia law, Islamic law they want to be governed by. 88% of Egyptians favor death for apostasy. And guess who they target for apostasy in Egypt? Christians. 2013 Pew study in the Middle East found that 16% support suicide bombing, and 25% of Egyptians alone support suicide bombing. That means 20 million people in Egypt support suicide bombing. Now, closer to home, a 2015 survey done in June of this year asked American Muslims, and this is what they found. 51% want the choice of embracing Sharia law, being governed by Sharia law versus the U.S. Constitution. Look at the Article 6 and you'll find out that the Constitution is supposed to be the supreme law of the land. 29% endorse violence against those who insult their prophet. 25% endorse violence against Americans as part of jihad. 24% support use of violence to punish those who offend Islam. And 1 out of 3 believe that ISIS is Islamic. Thank you, Mr. Obama. So, as the surveys suggest, a minority of Muslims approve of violence. So, you may ask, what do the rest of the Muslims believe? I'm glad you asked. You should recognize this man. He's the Caliph, Baghdadi. Well, there was an Iraqi Kurd columnist 2 months ago who wrote a very interesting column, and he directed it to Islamic sheikhs and imams, the holy people, allegedly. And he says, why aren't you calling the violence that ISIS is doing, call it jihad against them? Well, he had 3 explanations. He said, 1, either the sheikhs and the preachers of Islam are cowards and dare not speak the truth because they're fearful they will be killed. Or 2, their hearts are really with Islam. They believe this is the truth. This is what ought to be done. Or 3, their regimes are involved with ISIS and they are unable to disobey their leaders. My guess is that there's an element of all 3 in there. Now, section 2 of the book, I go through what I call the fascist Islamic Middle East. I start off by debunking, and there are a lot of myths here, about the Christian crusades, which are spun by the Islamic world to hide the Middle East's insecurities over falling behind the rest of the world and to clumsily excuse violent jihad. Then I deal with 8 universal conditions for genocide, especially as they apply today in the Middle East to Christians. And the evidence overwhelmingly indicates that Christian genocide is not only the fault of ISIS and the other Islamists, but also because of the environment, the culture in the Middle East, thanks to these Islamic governments. Egypt being one of those. And one of the 8 conditions is the absence of integrating institutions. If you recall, when Mohammed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood leader, was the president, he wreaked havoc over Egypt. What did he do? When he allowed dozens of churches to be burned, cars, schools, businesses, they would scratch on the wall, Egypt is Islamic, after they torched a particular worship place. Even the thought of anti-Christian violence in Egypt was, propagated by the likes of Morsi and his people. Now, fortunately, el-Sisi, the new president, has pushed him aside, but still institutionally there are very serious issues. Coptic Christians aren't safe in the Egyptian military. Some have been killed because they refused to convert. Christians can't hold high public office. Christians are routinely hassled when it comes to getting jobs, driver's licenses, or building permits. And the Egyptian courts, of course, make blasphemy a death sentence. And guess what? Blasphemy is used against mostly Christians, not Muslims. The third section is about the global community's fingerprints. Now, I could develop this, but what I wanted to focus on is the contribution by our current president, President Obama, because his Mideast, policies, what they are, not only have accelerated Christian genocide, but have left the region totally in turmoil and inflamed. Now, I think the real reason behind this is because he put all that aside. It was a deal he made with the devil, which is in Tehran. He says, I won't do this stuff which interferes with you as long as I get a deal with you. And, of course, we know that the Iranian deal is his legacy. So what are the failures? Look at Libya. This is a war choice. He went in with NATO, took it down, killed Gaddafi, and what do we have today? ISIS controls part of it. It's chaotic. It's a failed state. Israel, Cairo 09, he was at Cairo University. He threw Israel under the bus, jeopardized their security, a host of other things. Syria, it was our Democratic candidate for presidency, Hillary Clinton, who praised Assad as, quote, a reformer. And then our current Secretary of State said that Assad is an essential player. So where we are today in Syria, well, after 250,000 people are dead and millions have lost their homes, he's done little about red lines that are crossed, chemical weapons, etc. He's declared ISIS, of course, initially the JV, and now he admits it has taken root. He admitted his strategy of air strikes and training rebels has failed, so he turns it over to the Russians and the Iranians, and today, literally, thousands of Iranians, Hezbollah, and others are on the ground, and the Russians are bombing and killing more people. Yemen, well, his people said Yemen's going to be a template that will help us succeed against the terrorists in that region. Of course, Yemen's in civil war and has been for many months. Iraq, there he was, December of 11. In spite of a lot of good military advice, he stood in front of the 82nd Airborne soldiers and he said, Iraq is secure and stable. Then our vice president boasted that Iraq is our greatest achievement. Well, today, Iraq is in Tehran's pocket. It's lost significant territory to ISIS, and it's unlikely to ever be put back together. So as I mentioned a moment ago, I think this is really a deal that was made by Obama. I'll let you have the rest of the region as long as you give me this great deal. So what do we have? We have death to Israel, and we have this nuclear program that he put together. So, what did the deal do for us? Well, it made oppression of Christians much worse. It destabilized the region. It starts a serious arms race. It undermines trust in the United States in a major way. It accelerates Iran's terrorism. We give them $150 billion by canceling sanctions. And of course, Iran will become a nuclear weapon state. And yes, Israel is targeted, but so is the great Satan, the United States. Now, Obama said, well, if you have a better plan, why don't you propose it? Well, here's a better plan, Mr. Obama. A better plan would be one we could actually read. A better plan would be one that allowed Americans to join the inspection teams. A better plan would not lift a ban on missile testing. They did another one just last week. A better plan would not lift the ban on conventional weapons sales. A better plan would turn over the previous military dimensions of a nuclear program. A better plan would not agree to defend Iran's nuclear facilities from attack, i.e. Israel. A better plan would require Iran to publicly acknowledge that Israel has the right to exist. A better plan would require we get our American hostages back. And a better plan would be similar to what we did with Libya. And specifically, we got all their centrifuges, their nuclear material, and they allowed us anytime inspections of their area. Well, just a couple of weeks ago, Ayatollah Khomeini, the supreme leader there, he was talking to the Iranian Assembly of Experts, and he said, look, if they, the United States and the P5, if all they're going to do is suspend sanctions, not lift sanctions, well, then all we're going to do is to suspend our obligations. And then just yesterday, the Iranian parliament, by an overwhelming number, decided, okay, we'll rubber stamp that. We will just suspend our obligations. So what does that mean? Well, it means that they've abandoned the deal, and it's a deadly deal. Leaves us in jeopardy, I would argue, the entire region, and of course, all the residue that comes from bad deals that we've seen across the ages there. So, Section 4, implications of end times. Well, I go through a number of implications, one of which is looking, and I'll go to the next one, looking at parallels between the Jewish Holocaust and what's going on with Christians to Islamists. I looked at totalitarianism, collaborators, hate, apathy, but criminalizing public belief, It happened in Nazi Germany, it happens in the Middle East, but it could very well happen in this country. Just listen. The Nazis used propaganda and intimidation to win over the German public to support their radical anti-Jewish agenda. A sophisticated propaganda effort led by Joseph Goebbels sought to manipulate and to deceive the German people to support the Nazis' program. Goebbels used a message of national unity and a utopian future that facilitated the persecution of Jews who were excluded from the Nazi vision of the national community. Well, just as Hitler's propagandists portrayed Germany as a victim in order to create a pretext to carry out their plan, today's Middle East Islamists and some Arab regimes portray themselves as victims of Christian crusaders and Zionists. You hear it all the time. They spin tales that arouse Muslim population to fanatical behavior, especially the likes of ISIS, to justify harsh treatment of Christians and other non-Muslims. Now, criminalizing public belief by the Nazis or the Islamists, a concept that created a pretext for genocide, I fear, is creeping into the West, and we've seen evidence of it already in the UK. So how about end times? Well, I'm not a biblical scholar, nor pretend one, nor on television about one. I'm an analyst for national security. But I do have some insights here. First, the Muslim world, for them, Christians are an extension of the Jewish people and the modern nation of Israel. Therefore, destroying all aspects of Christendom across the Middle East is by association doing the same to Israel. In Never Submit, I take a premillennial position that Israel is the number one clue of just how near the time of Christ's return happens to be. After all, issues and events involving Israel are literally lighting up the spiritual radar of those who observe the times from biblical prophetic perspective. And for example, consider what Zechariah 12, 1 through 3 talks about. It talks about Israel being a burdensome stone for all people. Well, look around the neighborhood in the Middle East. Nobody likes Israel today. And in fact, the formation of ISIS is affiliated with its calls for the destruction of Israel, and then they always say the United States as well. The world pressure on Israel today to embrace a bad two-state solution with the Palestinians is ample proof as well. But then you go on and there's a general call for peace, yet labeling Israel as the burdensome stone blocking peace. So I would argue an honest evaluation of the evidence suggests that destruction of Christendom is the next best thing in their eyes to destroying Israel. Now, given the opportunity, and they'll seek it, they'll do that as well. Now skip to the New Testament and the Apostle Paul. And he talks about the end times man. Look at 2 Timothy 3:1. There's a litany of descriptors there. The end time man will be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, unholy, without natural affection. Don't these sound familiar? I've dealt with cultural issues for many decades, and it certainly sounds familiar, and it is getting worse from my perspective. Are these the end times? I don't know. But they certainly have the trappings of the end times. Now, what do the Islamists think about these times? Well, if you ask them, they say that we are indeed living in the end times. They're looking for their Messiah, their Mahdi, who is coming soon, they say, and he's going to establish an Islamic kingdom, and he's going to impose Islamic Sharia. They have their Isa, or their Jesus, who will return, and he's going to be the Mahdi's lieutenant, and he's going to force non-Muslims to convert or die. Then, of course, the Mahdi will come, and only once there's chaos and carnage, which explains why they both the Shia and the Sunni persuasions, call for the annihilation of the U.S. and Israel, because that will usher in their Mahdi. Now look specifically at Dabiq, or at the ISIS. Listen to their words. Read their literature. Here's some quotes. We perform jihad, eyes upon Al-Qud. Al-Qud, of course, is a city of Jerusalem. We fight here while our goal is Rome. Rome are Christians. The Mahdi will come any day, they say. We will conquer Rome, break their crosses, and enslave their women. Dabiq, which is shown up there, is taken from the prophet's hadith that says in the end times, the Christians will be destroyed by the Islamists at the town of Dabiq, a real town 6 miles south of the Turkey border, and of which is now controlled by ISIS. So how might they do this? Don't have a clue. However, I will tell you what they say. In May of 2015, ISIS wrote in Dabiq, their magazine, not by happenstance, an article that says, what we ought to do is get some nuclear weapons. This is what they wrote, not me. And with those weapons, we'll take them through Libya, Nigeria, Colombia, and up through the porous border of the United States in cars, and we'll cause destruction. Now, on the 7th of October, last week, Associated Press ran a very interesting story, and it had to do with nuclear material smugglers who were trying to link up with ISIS, and they had stuff to sell for big money. Now, ISIS has billions of dollars. Do they want to do this? I don't know. Will this propagate an end-time scenario? I don't know. Just interesting. Islamic Republic. The Shia clerical hierarchy, they believe, they know, they've met the Mahdi, the Messiah, and in fact that they are the earthly deputies of the Messiah. They call for the destruction of Israel and the U.S., and on and on. I'm not going to develop that, but many observers today see the chaotic events such as the genocide of Christians as evidence that we're closing on the end times. Like I say, I'm not a prophet. I don't know if this is true, but certainly there's a lot of bad stuff happening. So I end with, in Never Submit, with a prescription. You have to give a solution if you point out a problem. We need right leadership. We need a comprehensive plan. We need national level political effort, and we need grassroots level involvement. Leaders. Well, we need real leaders. People that are principled, not political cowards, people of God. I profile William Wilberforce, who of course, ended slavery in the United Kingdom. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, of course, worked against genocide of the Jews under the Nazis. And of course, Martin Luther King Jr., who worked against the injustice of segregation in America. These are the types of leaders that fill the gap that we need, I would argue, today. Now, whoever becomes our next president, I would say on day one, needs to call his cabinet together, and he needs to do, or she, 5 things. Need to declare that any country or group that participates in violence against Christians because of their faith is automatically an enemy of the United States. Must declare that any country that supports those enemies would be considered our enemy as well. They must welcome Christians seeking to immigrate to safe havens, whether it's here or elsewhere. They must establish refugee centers for Christians, and they must direct the Secretary of State to develop a foreign policy that makes religious freedom a top priority. Now, you need a plan. Now, you've heard about the Obama plan, which kind of wishy-washy, and it has clearly failed in that region. He doesn't talk about Christians, and he doesn't talk about end games that clearly are going to bring peace and stability to that region. Whatever this plan looks like, this plan must be followed through with. For instance, we need to know the enemy. Sun Tzu, a Chinese theorist, said, if you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the results of 100 battles. You need to understand that enemy, and you need to understand your own capabilities. The plan has to talk about supporting the effort. We can't just throw food at immigrants people that are starving, have been raped, that have been shot. We need to think long term. You know, I've talked to Franklin Graham, I've talked to a lot of leaders in our country about the long term stuff, and it's in Never Submit. We have to secure the effort. In other words, provide enclaves for Christians that don't have them today. That's why they're dying left and right. There won't be any in the next, I would say, 2 years at the most, because there's no safe place in the region for them. Information operations. We've all heard about the social media and how effective ISIS is. They are incredibly effective. The Pentagon's on its back when it comes to strategic communication. ISIS knows how to do it. And yet, you know, we can't seem to get our act together. That plan must address these things. We also need political action. In our form of government, our citizens enjoy the opportunity to influence the elected officials. Now that reminds me of someone 240 years ago that I would like to emulate. On 23 March 1775, Patrick Henry stood in St. John's Church there in Richmond, Virginia. He declared, quote, "Should I keep my opinions at such a time through fear of giving offense? I should consider myself as guilty of treason toward my country and as an act of disloyalty toward the majesty of heaven, which I revere above all earthly kings." And he finished. The war is actually begun. Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but for me, give me liberty or give me death. Well, I would say that his comments apply today. Islamists have declared war on Christians and on the West. We are losing that war. And if we sit on the sidelines, we will be in chains. Martin Luther King Jr. said that Christians must participate in America's political process in order, as Dr. King says, to be the conscience of the state. When they are rightly informed and motivated, they change the character of political debate and often the course of government. He said, 3 expectations. We need to make government accountable. Christians bring Christian values to our godless culture, and Christians provide a restraining influence on government. What should we demand of government? Federal government. Our embassies better make a litmus test of religious freedom for everything we do. We need to declare this a genocide, and that has legal ramifications based upon UN conventions. We need to modify the International Religious Freedom Act to give it some real teeth. And I have a litany of things on that. We need an immigration policy that rescues Christians from genocide and others. But Christians are the most threatened today. The Pentagon. We have to stop being political correct. You know, I can say firsthand, I've been over there 13 years this time. We are politically correct. And I've written about it over the years. Obama's anti-ISIS strategy is a failure. You know, we need a military strategy that works. And we should create enclaves to protect those that face genocide. Politically, we need to ask our presidential candidates about their position on Christian genocide, and we must insist it be part of their platforms. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this. I'll just briefly show you that I talk about 8 different vaccinations that are needed for the local community. We need grassroots involvement. The first one, which I'll briefly mention, is we need to get over this misinformation and ignorance. You know, Americans are involved in the latest football game or what the television is saying, not about what's happening in the world, much less in their neighborhood. What we need is a black robe regiment, much like we saw during the Revolution. The Black Robe Regiment were the pastors of America that called their congregations to action, that said, this is immoral, this is wrong, this must not stand. And they called their people, and they answered, and we saved our country. Christian pastors today have got to get involved. Frank Wolf told me, the American church is pathetic. It is silent. General Boykin, when I talked to him, he said the church totally ignores the issue of Christian persecution. Whatever the reason, too many pastors and church leaders remain absolutely silent today, and as a result, Christians are ill-prepared to recognize the evil that is right with us. You know, and I'll jump through the rest in the time. Now, I talk about civilizational jihad. You see that going on in Western Europe. It's coming to the community here in America as well. Very dangerous. I talk about, you know, what's happening in our schools. You can talk about Islam. You can't talk about Christianity today. Sharia law. We already have Sharia courts in the United States. And, you know, Article 6 is very clear. The U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And yet, you know, these people want to change our law. Well, it's happening in Western Europe. It's going to happen here if we don't stand up. You know, there's good material down in Dallas, Texas, about what's happening there. So I'll conclude with, you know, I'll ad-lib to a certain degree here. This is a real threat. Having been in the Mideast many years, having worked these issues for decades, for almost 5, this is very serious. This is going to redefine America if we don't do something and begin to do something very soon. You know, I have my choices on political candidates at the president and so forth. What I want is someone, like I pointed out earlier, a Wilberforce or a Martin Luther King Jr., people that, you know, understand how to fix things and understand what's morally right and wrong, not where the wind is blowing on a particular issue. We face a genuine existential threat, and it's creeping in here. And most people don't recognize that. And it's a shame. It's tragic. But hopefully Americans will begin to wake up before it's too late. You know, I was sitting in this very room on 9/11. I heard the sirens from the FBI building. I could look out and see the smoke from the Pentagon where I work today. Things radically changed. Before that, I was one of the few in the country who understood what, you know, Osama bin Laden was all about, because I wrote about him. I did television about the USS Cole. I talked about what happened in Kenya and Tanzania to our embassies. I said, this is a coming threat. Well, it came faster than any of us wanted. I've been working this issue since then, of course, in the Pentagon and doing it in media. These issues are not going away. They are not getting easier. They're getting more complex, and they're getting more dangerous. I think that perhaps, like the proverbial frog in the frying pan, maybe we don't understand how hot it really is. Well, with that, and there's a few minutes left, I will open myself to questions. And, you know, I actually only went through half of what I intended to, but that's all right. You know, there's enough bad stuff in here, and I hope some good stuff that I present. Questions? Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I'm Penny Star with CNS News.
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to ask you about what you said at the very beginning. You talked about the invasion of Iraq
Yep.
as being the moment when this whole thing started. I haven't heard that before. They talk about the Arab Spring being the first. So the invasion of Iraq would be under George W. Bush's command, whereas the Arab Spring under Obama. So could you expand on that, please?
Yeah, during the Bush administration, and I was part of the Rumsfeld media analysts, and I was with Fox News at the time, and, you know, so we had great access. I was also working with the Iraqi exile community. A good friend of mine, Fauzi al-Shamari, who was deposed by Saddam, and the CIA brought him to this country. And Fauzi and I had been meeting for months with some of the Iraqis in this country, and they said, look, Bob, we can give you Iraq on a platter if you support an insurgency. And I had access to senior Bush administration people, Rumsfeld, others, and I took Fauzi over there and we said, look, you know, you give us $25 million and we'll create an insurgency that will topple Saddam, because we know, because of our relationships, that Saddam's generals will cooperate with us. but it has to be done right. Well, there were some key leaders in the administration that dismissed it totally. I'm very angry because of that. And as a result, we invaded. And then I was there the summer of '03, and I watched the tragic circumstances that came out of not knowing what they were doing. I met with the people that were going to so-called put it together in phase 4 of the operation, and that's a military term, but it basically means, once the combat's over, how do we put the pieces back together? And we said, you don't have a plan, it won't work. You don't understand the difference between a Sunni and a Shia. They didn't. And so as a direct result, we really messed it up. We created a chaotic situation in which civil war came out of that. Before, we didn't have that. So we had the Kurds in the north, we had the Sunnis that were alienated, and the Shia were empowered. That started to fester throughout the region. And I believe that the people in Tunisia, in Libya, Egypt, they said, look what happened over there. I believe that began sort of the proverbial snowball to roll down the hill, and then one thing led to another. And of course, ISIS, we had al-Baghdadi in prison. In '06, we let him go, good prisoner. Now he's the caliph, and he's killing people left and right. History has a terrible way of repeating itself. I don't want the United States to do that, and yet I'm beginning to believe that under this administration, they don't even have a single history book.
Can I follow up on that? So the first was the invasion of Iraq, but then there's also the American troops leaving under Obama.
Oh, yeah.
And the SOFA you're aware of.
Status Forces Agreement.
Right. Is that part of it too? I'm just
well,
trying
of
to
course it's part of it because, Obama was not serious about that. And I can't tell you why I know that, but I do know that. They were not serious when they were negotiating in Baghdad about a SOFA. And as a direct result, we decided that, okay, we'll pack up and go home. Because Obama said he was going to do it in '08 anyway. He says, this war is over. Well, I'm history. And so he declares it a victory and heads home. And we knew exactly what would happen, and it did. And now we have ISIS, we have a country that won't be put back together again, and that spawned, of course, what is going on. Because behind the scenes, you have the people that were working with Saddam went over to work with Assad, and they created that chaotic situation. We could have stopped that too, but we chose not to. A lot of this happens behind the scenes, as you may suspect. And unfortunately, behind the scenes, we have some very stupid people.
Yeah. Would you agree that there, in the analytical side of the government, at least I've been told this by a number of people who've worked in the State Department and various places, you have a permeating secularism, a rejection of religious people aren't there and the people who are there don't analyze things in this way. Is it possible for the United States to actively even understand, as an institution, to understand people of a book? So could you expand on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. A professor, adjunct professor at the War College, and I teach the War College, wrote a paper this summer under the Peacekeeping Security Stability Operations Institute, PKSY. Very interesting because he's a professor of religion. And he said, you in the military have no idea about the forces of faith and how they motivate masses of people, much less create hostilities. And he says, you need to involve this in your teaching, your training of officers. And it's true. If anything, today we're removing all references to faith in our doctrine, in our teaching, and it's looked down upon. Christians especially are persecuted. Now, I work in the Pentagon. I see this stuff every day. It's very different. When I was in uniform a long time ago in the Pentagon, we had Bible study groups, we had prayer groups, we had music groups. Today, none of that, except under certain, very limited situations. Radically changed in the culture. I was talking to Bob Scales the other day. He was going to be on Greta's program Monday night, I think it was. And I said, look, Bob, the he didn't understand about this Bergdahl situation. I said, this is what's happened. The culture has radically changed. And you can thank the seculars that have taken over the Pentagon. You really can. Obama's accelerated it. It wasn't all that great under Bush either. So I'm going to be upfront with you. The Bush people were bad. I was interviewed. I was considered for some very senior positions. I'm glad I didn't get those. But it became very evident to me that because I had been in this organization and I was marked as being an author of Don't Ask, Don't Tell and being opposed to women in direct ground combat, that I was unfit for those positions. I'm smarter than most of them, but it doesn't really matter because it comes down to it, your political correctness and your obedience and your party affiliations. Those are all what's key. And I'm old enough now to have been here. My mother used to work in the Ford White House and on Capitol Hill, so I've seen this city in many ways over the last half a century, and it has changed, and it's changed for the worse as far as I'm concerned. Other questions?
Yes, what do you think the military strategy would be for ISIS? Do you think we should just send ground troops in like we did with Iraq? And if so, how would that be any different if they would just have to stay there interminably?
Well, the difficulty today is that, once the barn door has been left open and they have made a chaotic situation. The battlefield is so complex today. You've got Russians, you have Turks that don't want us there. We have U.S. flying. We aren't coordinating our aircraft. You've got Kurds. You have about 100 different groups on the ground. You have Assad. The Israelis don't like people firing in, so they fire back. It is the most complex battlefield I think anyone has ever seen. Now, having said that, what do? No, I don't want to send divisions of U.S. forces into that mess because I don't think it's going to resolve anything. Now, there's a different issue, though. Special operations, and taking out certain leaders. I would favor that. We're doing certain activities we don't talk about that we probably need to continue. But we also, like President Obama, turned his hand back to Putin just yesterday. He said, Putin said, look, let me send Medvedev and my defense minister. We'll sit down and we can see if we can work something out. Well, at this point, why not? He's already blown his foreign policy. His reputation is destroyed. What we want to do is try to bring some stability. I don't like Assad either, but he's killed 250,000 people. Are we going to have to kill another 500,000 in order to fix this? So I'd do some special forces. I would probably cooperate with the Russians now that they pushed their way in there. We have to cooperate with the Turks. We'll recognize all these radical agendas out there. ISIS has got to go. I'd start killing them as fast as I could or incarcerate them if they don't want to get killed. You've got to have a plan. And as a strategist, I write plans. You tell me what you want, boss, and I will get you there as long as you give me the resources. So I can write a plan that would do this. But unfortunately, we don't have anyone that has an idea as to where they want to go. They just, the other night on 60 Minutes, what did Obama say? A coalition of nations is going to fix this. What? No, they aren't. The coalition of nations looks for a leader. The leader in the past has been in the United States, and now they're starting to, like Bibi Netanyahu heading to Moscow, like the Iranian mullahs heading to Moscow. They're seeing that Putin at least is demonstrating some leadership. And you can make the argument today that Putin wants to bring stability, and stability Assad provided before, and he protected Christians. So does that mean, by association, that Putin is the protector of Christians? That's a weird concept, but given what's going on in this crazy world, that may be true. Okay, now I get to go back to Pentagon. Good luck. Yeah. Thank you.